April 19, 1945. The USS Comfort. Somewhere in the Pacific, the ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, a blue expanse interrupted only by the white wake trailing behind the hospital ship. Below deck, in a corridor painted regulation white, a young Japanese woman sat on a wooden bench, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her name was Kimiko Tanaka, a nurse who had been captured 3 weeks earlier during the fall of Okinawa. She wore an ill-fitting cotton dress provided by her captors. The Americans and her eyes remained fixed on the floor. As she had been trained since childhood, the ship swayed gently. Somewhere above, she could hear footsteps. Soft footsteps, she noticed. Not the heavy boots of soldiers, but something lighter, more measured. The sound confused her. In the Imperial Japanese Army, hospitals near the front were chaotic places where male surgeons barked orders and wounded men screamed through the night. She had worked in one such hospital for 18 months, where she had learned to expect blood, chaos, and the ever-present threat of bombardment. But here, on this American vessel, the sounds were different. There was order. It was calm. And most confusing of all, there were no men. If you enjoy videos like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss our daily uploads. The door at the end of the corridor opened. A woman in a crisp Navy nurse uniform approached, her bearing confident but not harsh. She carried a clipboard and wore her brown hair pinned back with military precision. She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes, and gestured for Kimiko to follow. The Japanese nurse rose slowly, uncertain of what awaited her, conditioned to expect interrogation or worse. Instead, she was led into a ward where 24 beds were arranged in neat rows, each with clean white sheets. And attending to these beds, checking charts, administering medications, and speaking quietly with patients, were only women. American women. Women in charge. Kimiko stopped walking. Her breath caught in her throat. In that moment, everything she had been taught about the enemy, about the proper role of women, about the destiny of Japan and the weakness of the West, all of it began to fracture like glass struck by an invisible hammer. To understand the shock that reverberated through Kimiko Tanaka and thousands of women like her, one must first understand the world from which they came. Imperial Japan in the early 20th century had constructed a rigid social order based on Confucian principles filtered through militaristic nationalism. Women existed within a clearly defined hierarchy. They were daughters, then wives, then mothers. Their purpose was to serve the family, to produce sons for the emperor, and to maintain the household, while men conducted the business of empire. Education for women focused on domestic skills, moral instruction, and absolute obedience. A popular phrase of the era captured this sentiment perfectly. Good wife. Wise mother Ryosai Kenbo, ideal to which all women should aspire. When Japan mobilized for total war in the late 1930s, women were called upon to serve, but always within carefully prescribed boundaries. They could work in factories, yes, but under male supervision. They could serve as nurses, certainly, but only as assistants to male doctors who held all authority. The very concept of a woman making independent medical decisions, commanding a hospital ward, or holding rank equivalent to male officers was not merely unusual, it was inconceivable, even obscene. The military structure reinforced this at every level. Female nurses in the Japanese army held no official rank. They were classified as civilian auxiliaries, subject to military discipline, but granted none of its privileges. They could be ordered about by any male soldier, regardless of that soldier's actual medical knowledge or rank. Moreover, Japanese propaganda had spent years constructing a specific image of the enemy. Americans, they were told, were soft, decadent, obsessed with material comfort and individual pleasure. American women were portrayed as frivolous creatures, obsessed with cosmetics and Hollywood films, lacking the moral fiber and self-sacrifice that defined Japanese womanhood. The propaganda emphasized that American women had abandoned their natural role, that their society was degenerating because women sought to imitate men. This degeneracy, the narrative went, was why America would ultimately lose the war. A nation. that allowed its women such freedom could never match the disciplined ferocity of the imperial forces. And yet, here was Kimiko Tanaka, standing in a fully functional surgical ward aboard a moving ship, surrounded by American women who seemed to command it with absolute authority. The head nurse Lieutenant Commander Sarah Hayes noticed Kimiko's frozen stance. She approached slowly, speaking in careful, broken Japanese learned from a phrasebook. "You are safe. You will not be harmed." The words were simple, but the tone carried weight. Hayes gestured around the ward, then to herself and her staff. "We are nurses, like you." She pointed to the red cross on her uniform, then to the identification Kimiko still wore from her time in the Imperial Army Medical Corps. Same, but it was not the same. Kimiko's eyes traced the room, cataloging impossible details. The American nurses moved with purpose and confidence. They consulted charts without seeking approval from any male authority. One nurse appeared quite young, perhaps only 20, was adjusting an intravenous drip while explaining something to a patient. Another was preparing surgical instruments on a sterile tray. Third was actually giving orders to a male orderly, a Navy corpsman who listened attentively and then hurried off to fulfill her request. The male subordinate obeyed the female superior, without question, without resentment, as though this were the most natural thing in the world. Lieutenant Commander Hayes led Kimiko to a small office adjacent to the ward. On the wall hung a chart showing the ship's medical staff organization. Hayes pointed to her own name at the top of the nursing hierarchy. Beneath her were dozens of other names, all women organized by rank and specialty. "We run the nursing operations," Hayes explained through a combination of gestures and simple words. "We make decisions about patient care. We have authority." The word authority hung in the air. In Japanese, Kingan power delegated from above, the right to command. Kimiko had never heard this word applied to women in a military context. It seemed like a linguistic impossibility, like describing water that flowed upward. The USS Comfort was one of several hospital ships operating in the Pacific Theater in 1945, but it represented something much larger than its physical presence. It was a floating embodiment of a social revolution that had been quietly transforming American society for decades. United States Navy Nurse Corps had been established in 1908, granting women official military status, though without full rank or pay equity at first. But by World War II, the system had evolved dramatically. The Navy granted its nurses actual officer ranks, equivalent to male officers, with corresponding authority and pay. They could command medical staff, make critical decisions about patient care, and expect military courtesy from male personnel. More than 11,000 Navy nurses served during World War II, and thousands more served in the Army Nurse Corps, under similar conditions. This was not merely a practical wartime expedient. It reflected deeper currents in American society: the women's suffrage movement, the slow expansion of educational opportunities, the growing recognition that competence was not determined by gender. American women had been attending medical schools since the late 19th century. They had been voting since 1920. They worked in laboratories, taught at universities, and increasingly occupied professional roles that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. The war accelerated these trends, but did not create them. For the Japanese, women captured during the final year of the Pacific War, encountering this reality produced profound cognitive dissonance. Everything they had been taught suggested that such a system should be chaotic, that women given authority would be overwhelmed, that male soldiers would refuse to follow female leadership. And yet, evidence before their eyes told a different story entirely. Ensign Michiko Yamada had been a military nurse on Saipan. When American forces overran the island in July 1944, she had expected immediate execution. That was what Japanese soldiers were told would happen if captured. Instead, she was transported to a U.S. military hospital facility, where she spent the next 11 months as a prisoner of war. In a diary she kept secretly, later discovered and translated by historians, she recorded her observations with meticulous detail. The American women wear the same uniforms as their male soldiers, but in a different color. They carry ranks on their shoulders. I have learned these are called lieutenant and captain. The men salute them. At first I thought this was mockery, a cruel joke. but I have watched carefully for many weeks now. The respect is genuine. When a woman officer gives an order, the male soldiers obey immediately, without hesitation.
Oh.
They do not seem humiliated by this. They seem to consider it normal. Later in the same diary, she wrote, "Today I witnessed something I still cannot fully believe. A surgery was being performed on a wounded American soldier. His leg was badly injured by shrapnel. The chief surgeon was a man, but assisting him was a nurse officer, a lieutenant. During the surgery, the nurse noticed a problem with the bleeding. I think she spoke sharply to the doctor. He listened to her. He actually changed what he was doing based on her suggestion. Afterward, I heard him thank her. In our hospitals, a nurse who spoke to a doctor in such a manner would have been struck. Here, her expertise was valued more than her gender. This pattern repeated itself in testimony after testimony, diary after diary. Japanese female prisoners of war, most of whom were nurses or civilian medical personnel, found themselves in a world that contradicted everything their society had taught them. And nowhere was this contradiction more stark than in the all-women hospital facilities that began appearing as the war drew to a close. In March 1945, the U.S. military established a specialized medical facility on Guam, specifically for the treatment and processing of female prisoners of war and civilian internees. The facility was staffed entirely by women doctors, nurses, administrators, security personnel, and interpreters. This was not done primarily for political reasons or as a propaganda gesture. It was a practical response to the complex medical and psychological needs of female POWs, many of whom had suffered severe trauma and who might feel more comfortable with female caregivers. But the symbolic impact was profound for the first time. Japanese women who had spent their entire lives in a rigidly patriarchal society found themselves in an environment where women held every position of power and authority. There were no men to defer to, no male voices to override female judgment. Every decision, from the daily medical rounds to the management of supplies to the discipline of unruly patients, was made by women. The facility's commander was Captain Dorothy Miller, a career Navy nurse who had joined the service in 1938 and had risen through the ranks to become one of the most respected medical administrators in the Pacific Theater. She ran the facility with military precision, but also with the awareness of the cultural shock her prisoners were experiencing. In a report filed with the Navy Department in June 1945, she wrote, "The Japanese female POWs arrive in a state of extreme psychological distress. They have been taught to expect torture or death. Instead, they find themselves in a clean, well-organized medical facility where they receive professional care. But the deeper shock comes from the realization that this facility is run entirely by women. I have watched their faces during the first few days, confusion, disbelief, and then something else. Curiosity, perhaps. Or the first stirrings of a very different understanding about what women can achieve. The daily routine in the facility reinforced this new reality at every turn. Morning rounds were conducted by Dr. Helen Park, a surgeon who had graduated from Johns Hopkins Medical School in 1938. She moved through the wards with her team of nurses, examining patients, ordering treatments, and making decisions that could mean life or death. The Japanese prisoners watched her with fascination. She was not merely competent, she was authoritative, knowledgeable, unquestionably in command. And she was a woman, one of the interpreters at the facility, a Japanese-American woman named Grace Tanaka, who had volunteered for military service despite her family being interned in California, recalled a conversation with a prisoner named Setsuko. Setsuko asked me if Dr. Park was the doctor's wife. I didn't understand the question at first. Then I realized she couldn't conceive that Dr. Park was the actual surgeon. She thought Dr. Park must be a courtesy title. Or perhaps the woman was married to the real doctor who must be somewhere else. When I explained that, no, Dr. Park was the chief surgeon, that she had attended medical school and performed operations and held the rank of commander, Setsuko was silent for a long time. Then she said something I will never forget. Then everything we were told was a lie. The food became a symbol, as it so often did in accounts of prisoners encountering American abundance. In the women's hospital on Guam, Meals were served 3 times a day, substantial meals with protein, vegetables, fruit, bread, and milk. Real milk, not the watered-down substitute that had become common in Japan as the war dragged on. The prisoners, many of whom had been subsisting on meager rations for months or years, could not quite believe it, but it was not just the quantity that impressed them. It was the care with which it was presented. Meals were served on proper trays, with utensils, napkins, and even occasional garnishes. The American nurses ate the same food as the prisoners. There was no separate, superior ration for the staff. Everyone ate together in a common dining hall. The message was subtle, but unmistakable. You are not subhuman. You are patients, and you will be treated with dignity. Yuriko Nakamura, a civilian nurse who had been working in a Japanese military hospital in Manila when the city fell, remembered the first time she was offered seconds at a meal. I thought it was a test. Perhaps if I took more food, I would be punished for greed. But the American nurse, her name was Lieutenant Morrison, simply smiled and placed more vegetables on my plate. She did not act as though she was bestowing a great favor. It was ordinary to her. Everyone should have enough to eat. This was her assumption, and I realized that in Japan, even before the war, I had never assumed such a thing. There were always hierarchies of who deserved more and who deserved less. But here, in this place run by women, the assumption was equality. The symbolism extended beyond food to every aspect of daily life. The hospital provided clean clothing, not uniforms exactly, but simple dresses and undergarments made of decent fabric. Prisoners were given soap, real soap, not the harsh ersatz product that had become common in Japan. They were given towels, toothbrushes, sanitary supplies. These were not luxuries. They were basics. And the American nurses provided them without ceremony, as though it were simply obvious that people should have these things. Many of the Japanese prisoners had been taught that American wealth was a sign of moral weakness. That material abundance bred soft, undisciplined character. But living within this abundance, experiencing it daily, began to erode that narrative. The American nurses were not soft. They worked 12-hour shifts. They maintained strict discipline. They demanded high standards of cleanliness and efficiency. But they also believed deeply, reflexively, that human beings deserved certain basic conditions: clean water, adequate food, medical care, rest. These were not rewards to be earned through proper ideological devotion. They were rights. The transformation in perception happened gradually, then all at once. For the first weeks, most prisoners remained withdrawn, suspicious, waiting for the cruelty they had been promised would come, but the cruelty never came. Instead, there was routine. There was professional medical care. There were American women who treated their Japanese counterparts not as conquered enemies, but as colleagues in the same profession. Lieutenant Patricia Chen, a Chinese-American nurse who served at the Guam facility, described the breakthrough moment she witnessed with one prisoner. There was a woman named Hanako who had been captured on Iwo Jima. She had worked as a surgical nurse and had seen terrible things. For the first month, she refused to speak to any of us. She performed her assigned tasks in the hospital. We had the healthier prisoners assist with basic care duties, but she never made eye contact, never initiated conversation. Then one day I was treating a patient with a serious abdominal wound, changing the dressing, and I was alone. My usual assistant was ill. The procedure was complex, and I needed extra hands. Hanako was nearby. Without thinking, I asked her to assist, and she did. She stepped forward and helped me with absolute professionalism. Her technique was excellent. When we finished, I thanked her. She looked at me really, looked at me on, said in careful English, "You are a good nurse." It was the first time she had acknowledged us as peers. Asterisk, these small moments of recognition accumulated. Japanese nurses began asking questions about American medical training. How long did one study? Where did women go to learn these skills? What examinations were required? The answers astonished them. American nurses attended dedicated nursing schools, some associated with hospitals, others with universities. The programs were rigorous, often 3 years long, and included both classroom instruction and clinical practice. Graduates received actual diplomas, recognized credentials that had value throughout the society, and for those who wished to go further, the path existed. Women could attend medical school. The numbers were small. Yes, only about 5% of American doctors in 1945 were women, but it was possible. It was a recognized path. There were women surgeons, women researchers, women teaching at medical schools. The system had not achieved equality, not remotely, but it had created openings that Japanese society had never imagined. Dr. Helen Park, the chief surgeon at the Guam facility, made a point of speaking with the Japanese prisoners about her own career. She had grown up in a middle-class family in Ohio. She had been a strong student and had decided at age 16 that she wanted to become a doctor. Her parents, both of them, had supported this ambition. She had attended a women's college, then applied to medical schools. Hopkins had accepted her. She had graduated near the top of her class. She had completed a surgical residency. And now, at age 34, she was a commander in the United States Navy, responsible for a major medical facility, supervising dozens of staff, making decisions that affected hundreds of lives. When she told this story, the Japanese prisoners listened with an intensity that was almost painful to witness. They were not hearing about an exceptional woman who had overcome extraordinary odds. They were hearing about a system imperfect, certainly, but a system nonetheless that allowed women to pursue professional excellence, that granted them authority when they demonstrated competence, that did not assume their gender automatically disqualified them. From serious work, the ideological implications began to surface in unexpected ways. Keiko Suzuki, a prisoner who had been a teacher before being conscripted as a military nurse, started asking political questions of the interpreters. What about Japanese propaganda that said American women were frivolous and obsessed with Hollywood? Grace Tanaka, the interpreter, laughed gently. Some American women like movies, she said. So do some American men. But liking entertainment doesn't mean you can't also be serious about your work. Dr. Park loves music. She has a collection of phonograph records. Does that make her a bad surgeon? The question was rhetorical, but it cut to the heart of a false dichotomy the Japanese prisoners had been taught. In their understanding, women were either serious and self-sacrificing, the good wife, wise mother, or they were frivolous and selfish, the decadent Western woman. The idea that a person could be both professionally competent and personally expressive, that these were not contradictory qualities, introduced a more complex understanding of human possibility. Another prisoner, Fumiko, who had been captured in the Philippines, began asking about American democracy. How could such a diverse, individualistic society function? Didn't everyone just do whatever they wanted, leading to chaos? The nurses tried to explain the concept of rights balanced with responsibilities, of laws that applied equally to everyone, of the idea that individual freedom actually strengthened the society because it's allowed everyone to contribute their best talents. These were not easy concepts to convey, especially across language barriers and profound cultural differences. But the hospital itself served as a demonstration. Here was a complex organization with hundreds of people, running smoothly, providing excellent medical care, maintaining discipline and order, all under female leadership, all within a framework that respected individual dignity while demanding professional competence. The contrast with the Japanese military system was stark and impossible to ignore. In the Imperial Army, hierarchy was everything. Orders flowed downward and were to be obeyed without question. Individual initiative was discouraged. Women had no voice in decision-making. And this system, they had been told, was superior, more efficient, more disciplined, more spiritually pure than the chaotic individualism of the Americans. But the evidence contradicted the narrative. The American system, with its recognition of individual competence, its willingness to promote based on merit rather than simply gender or social background, its assumption that intelligent people should be encouraged to use their judgment, this system was producing better results. The medical care was superior. The hospital ran more smoothly. Patients recovered more quickly. Even the morale among the staff was visibly higher. The American nurses seemed to genuinely enjoy their work, to take pride in their expertise. to feel respected and valued. By the summer of 1945, as Japan itself faced imminent invasion and the war approached its apocalyptic conclusion, the population of female POWs in American custody had grown substantially. Most were nurses, but there were also civilian women who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time: teachers, administrators, factory workers, and even a few journalists. All of them cycled through facilities like the one on Guam, and all of them carried back into prisoner populations a deeply subversive message. The enemy is not what we were told. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Hayes, the nurse who had first encountered Kimiko Tanaka aboard the USS Comfort, kept detailed notes about the psychological transformation she observed. In an interview conducted decades later, after classified documents were released, she reflected on those months. "I don't think we understood at the time the impact we were having. We were just doing our jobs, providing medical care, maintaining military discipline, treating patients with professional respect. But for the Japanese women, it was revolutionary. They had been told that women in authority would be weak, indecisive, emotional. They had been told that American women were superficial and lazy. And then they met us Navy nurses who worked 12-hour shifts, who made life and death decisions, who commanded respect from male soldiers, ran entire hospital facilities with competence and confidence. It shattered their assumptions." The most poignant transformations happened among the Japanese nurses themselves. These were women who had chosen medical service, who had demonstrated competence and dedication, but who had been forced to operate within a system that fundamentally devalued their contributions. Meeting American nurses who were treated as full professionals, who held military rank, who were paid accordingly, and granted authority commensurate with their expertise, it was like showing them an alternate universe where their talents were actually recognized. Some of them began to imagine a different future. In quiet conversations, in the privacy of their barracks at night, they talked about what Japan might become after the war. If Japan lost stand by mid-1945, most of them understood that defeat was inevitable. Then perhaps the occupation authorities would bring changes. Perhaps Japanese women might attend universities in greater numbers. Perhaps they might enter professions beyond teaching and nursing. Perhaps, in some distant future, a Japanese woman might even become a doctor, a lawyer, a politician. These were dangerous thoughts, even to think them privately. They represented a betrayal of everything the imperial system stood for. And yet, once planted, they grew. The American Women-Only Hospital had done more than provide medical care. It had provided a glimpse of possibility, a working model of a society organized on different principles. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast that most Japanese citizens heard for the first time. In the prison facilities, the news landed like a physical blow. Some prisoners wept. Others sat in stunned silence. A few, the most devoted believers in the imperial cause, had to be sedated because they attempted self-harm to die rather than live with the shame of defeat. But among the nurses, particularly those who had spent months in the American medical facilities, the reaction was more complex. There was grief certainly for the suffering their country had endured and would continue to endure. There was shame for the defeat. But there was also something else, something harder to name. Relief, perhaps, or the first stirrings of hope that a different kind of future might be possible.
Kimiko Tanaka, the young nurse who had been so bewildered by the USS Comfort, was on Guam when the surrender was announced.
She sat in the common room of the hospital facility, listening to the news through an interpreter, and then she did something unexpected. She stood up and walked to the office of Captain Dorothy Miller, the facility commander. She knocked on the door, waited for permission, and entered. Through the interpreter, she asked a question. After the war, when we return to Japan, will we be allowed to continue working as nurses? Captain Miller smiled. I don't know what your new government will decide, but I can tell you this. You are skilled, competent medical professionals. You have value. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. It was a small moment, easily forgotten in the chaos of war's end. But for Kimiko, it carried enormous weight. An American military officer woman had affirmed her professional worth. not her value as a wife or mother or servant to male authority, but her specific individual competence as a nurse. It was the first time in her life anyone in authority had spoken to her in such terms. The occupation of Japan, which began in late August 1945 and lasted until 1952, brought sweeping social changes. The American authorities, led by General Douglas MacArthur, imposed a new constitution that included revolutionary provisions, sovereignty of the people, renunciation of war, and critically legal equality of the sexes. Article 14 explicitly prohibited discrimination based on sex. Article 24 guaranteed equality in marriage and divorce. Women received the right to vote. Access to education expanded dramatically. These changes did not happen because American policymakers were particularly enlightened about women's rights. The motivations were complex and often pragmatic, but the effect was transformative. Japanese women who had experienced even a glimpse of alternative possibilities during the war years now had legal frameworks to pursue them. Many of the former POW nurses became advocates for professional medical training for women. Kimiko Tanaka, after returning to Japan, enrolled in a new nursing program established under the occupation authorities. The program was based on American models, rigorous, science-based, granting recognized credentials. She graduated in 1948 and went on to become a nursing instructor, teaching a new generation of Japanese women according to international standards. Others went even further. Michiko Yamada, the nurse who had kept the detailed diary of her observations on Saipan, eventually attended medical school in the 1950s, one of the first generation of Japanese women to do so. In interviews late in her life, she attributed her decision directly to her experiences as a POW. I had believed what we were taught, that women could not handle the responsibility of being doctors, that our minds were not suited for such complex work. But I saw American women doing exactly that work, and doing it brilliantly. I realized the limitation was not in women's abilities. It was in the system that refused to train us, and then blamed us for being untrained.
Ow.
Once I understood that, I could not unknow it. I had to try. The symbolic power of the women-only hospitals extended beyond individual transformations. They became part of a larger narrative about what defeat had revealed. Japan had mobilized every resource, had demanded total sacrifice from its citizens, had preached the spiritual superiority of its cause. And yet, it had lost to a nation that allowed its women to work as doctors, that fed even its prisoners abundant meals, that operated according to principles of individual rights rather than absolute obedience to hierarchy. This created a crisis of meaning. If the old system had been correct, if spiritual purity and devotion to hierarchy were truly the highest values, then Japan should have won. But Japan had lost, catastrophically, which meant either the universe was unjust and meaningless, or the old system had been based on flawed premises. For the women who had witnessed the American alternative, the answer was clear. The old premises had been wrong. Not about everything. Perhaps Japanese culture retained many beautiful and valuable traditions. But about the fundamental question of human worth and potential, women could be more than wives and mothers. They could be professionals, leaders, decision-makers. And societies that recognized this were not weaker, were stronger, more resilient, more innovative. The epilogue to this story stretches across decades. The women who experienced the shock of the American women-only hospitals became teachers, nurses, doctors, and administrators in post-war Japan. They raised daughters who attended universities, entered professions, and eventually changed laws. The process was neither smooth nor complete. Japan still struggled with gender equality well into the 21st century. As did America itself. The seed had been planted in 1975. 30 years after the war's end, a group of former Japanese military nurses held a reunion in Tokyo. Among them were several women who had been POWs, including Kimiko Tanaka. Now in her 50s, she had spent 3 decades working in nursing education, training thousands of young women in a profession that finally granted them respect and recognition. At the reunion, someone asked her about her most vivid memory from the war. She thought for a long time before answering. Finally, she said, The moment I stepped onto that American hospital ship and realized all the people in charge were women, it was like stepping through a door into a different world. And once you've seen that such a world is possible, you can never quite convince yourself to accept the limitations of the old one. The American hospital ships and medical facilities of World War II served many purposes. They treated wounded soldiers, saving countless lives through advanced medical care and rapid evacuation. They demonstrated American logistical superiority and organizational skill. They provided humanitarian care, even to enemy prisoners, upholding the Geneva Conventions when other powers flagrantly violated them. But for the Japanese women who passed through them, they served another function entirely. They were laboratories of possibility, demonstrations of an alternative social order. They proved that the propaganda had been lies, not exaggerations or distortions, but fundamental lies about what women could achieve, about what made a society strong, about the relationship between individual freedom and collective success. The symbolic object that recurred in testimonies and memoirs was not a weapon or a flag or even the abundant food, though all of these mattered. It was the rank insignia on the shoulders of the American nurses. Those small metal pins, lieutenant bars, captain bars. Commanders' oak leaves represented something revolutionary, formal recognition of women's authority. They meant that competence could override gender, that expertise deserved respect regardless of who possessed it, that hierarchy could be based on merit rather than immutable characteristics of birth for women who had been taught from childhood, that their highest calling was obedient service to male authority. Those rank insignia shattered entire philosophical frameworks. They suggested that maybe, just maybe, the society that honored women's competence was not morally bankrupt. Maybe it was more just. Maybe it was worth emulating. In the end, the story of Japanese women POWs, encountering America's women-only hospitals, is not primarily a story about military medicine or prisoner treatment, though it involves both. It is a story about the power of lived experience to override propaganda, about how witnessing an alternative can transform understanding, about the way small moments, a female lieutenant commander giving orders to male subordinates, a female surgeon making a life-saving decision, a meal served with dignity to prisoners can accumulate into revolutionary insight. The American women who staffed those facilities were not trying to change the world. They were doing their jobs, fulfilling their military duties, providing care to those who needed it. But in doing so, with competence and confidence and the unconscious assumption that their authority was legitimate, they demonstrated a truth that no amount of ideological instruction could fully obscure. That human potential is not bound by gender, that societies that recognize this are stronger, and that freedom, real freedom, the freedom to pursue one's talents wherever they lead, is not a weakness, but a profound source of strength. The women-only hospitals stood as monuments to this principle. In the middle of history's most destructive war, in facilities designed to heal bodies broken by violence, a different kind of healing also took place. Minds opened, assumptions crumbled, possibilities emerged. And when the war ended and the survivors returned home to build new lives in a transformed Japan, they carried with them the memory of what they had witnessed, a glimpse of what the world might become. If only human society could learn to stop wasting half its talent. That glimpse, once seen, could never be forgotten. It became a standard against which the old ways would always be measured and found wanting. And gradually, incompletely against fierce resistance but with undeniable momentum, the world those women had glimpsed began to emerge from the world they had known. Not perfect, not equal, but possible. And possibility, once demonstrated, is the most powerful force in human history. In the vast Pacific, aboard ships painted white with red crosses, in hospitals run by women who wore military rank and commanded respect, the future announced itself quietly, without fanfare. Through the simple act of competent women doing their jobs well, the Japanese prisoners who witnessed this carried the message forward. Each in her own way, teaching daughters and students and patients that the limitations they had been taught to accept were not natural law, but human choice, and choice, unlike fate, can be changed.